I couldn't define the title because actually I will be speaking about the gap between the abstraction and the concreteness and the universal and singular material, some kind of very banal duality that philosophy is all the time obsessed with, nevertheless never coming to any resolution in this issue. And this, to a certain extent, is work in progress, and I would say that my paper doesn't have a very dramatic introduction and dramatic conclusion. So, something like, and this is the final exeunt. Nevertheless, I would say that this is part of my research, which I do with the Soviet socialist ethics and aesthetics of 60s and 70s, to reconsider how certain notions which are demised and which are deconstructed in post-structuralism, in psychoanalysis, in post-operaism, recur back and organize the Marxist thought while they're not necessarily ideologically biased. History of philosophy, as we know, is thinking this divergence between notion and thing, general and immanent. And this is also the kernel of new post-philosophies, because it is obsessed with the farewell to idea, universe, subject, the general, indulging and dissipating in immanencies, and this post-Deleuzian fashion is quite widespread, especially among my students and younger generation. And when we come to necessity to define the dialectics between incorporeal and corporeal, idea and body, we all the time are at the impasse and in the trap of choosing either one or another. So we have to choose one or another as some kind of declared ideology. Actually, psychoanalysis, I think, to a very considerable extent, tried to solve this problem in terms of not rejecting such matters and such categories as the mind, the subject, ideal, consciousness, so not rejecting completely the sublimities, but nevertheless organizing these sublimities as emptinesses, ruptures, cracks, as instruments of operating with the real and reality. So what is the subversive achievement of Lacan is that he explicitly marked that the sublimities, although traumatic and sometimes fatal, cannot be evacuated from our horizon and from the subject's horizon. A popular example here, I have many popular examples which I bring forth from psychoanalysis, how it treats this sublimity. One very popular one is how Wagner pops up as the difference and deconstruction composer with Badiou and Zizek. So instead of being a totality and redemption figure, he starts to be some kind of Derrida of music. And so this is a very good example, very poppy, but still. And another poppy example is from this film with Zizek when he talks about ideology and film.
Guide
to he is commenting on sublimity in Beethoven's Ode to Joy, claiming that this idea all unite is very stupid, although it can be communist, and Schiller was some kind of cryptic communism, but it is absolutely idiotic and stupid, and Beethoven would be as stupid if he did not take into consideration some ironic crack within this allegation, all unite. And to claim that Beethoven was not such an idiot to claim directly all unite, this sublimity, he gives an example from Zizek gives an example from Clockwork Orange, where Beethoven is performed like jazz, in a swing manner, saying that, look, this is criticism. If Beethoven had not implied initially such a critique and such a decomposition of sublimity within this irony would not be possible afterwards. So this is the presumption that I would dispute to a certain extent, because I think that Beethoven was an idiot. And it's very good that he was an idiot. And it's very necessary that he should be even an idiot. So maybe the case is not that he's a full-fledged ideologist in terms of addressing everyone to unite, absolutely irresponsibly not understanding who could be excluded from this unification. But at the same time, he's not an ironist either. I think that I don't have an answer yet. I have to still develop this answer. But I think that what happens here is the infantile, hysterical, clownish, immature necessity of the general. And I would imply this necessity rather than desiring the general. Some kind of need which is quite urgent. And urgent to the extent when it can converge and combine the immanence and the mind. So the issue that emerges in this very crazy and very often non-convincing efforts of such philosophers as Ilyenkov to coin Hegel and Spinoza, so the immanence thought and the idea thought, was to prove that we don't need to choose between one or another, but we can prove that one is the other. That Hegel is relatively Spinozist himself, and Spinoza is relatively dialectical, if we look at him closely. But by this token, the issue was to overcome dualism and to claim that Spinoza's materialism, monism, is not quite that simple monism, but at the same time that this emptiness of the ideal is not something that is dominating the reality, the unconscious, but maybe the matter itself. This is one of the main presumptions and premises of Ilyenkov, that the matter itself is able to inscribe a necessity of thinking. So the matter itself can inscribe into itself generality, and whatever is the matter is immediately general, and whatever is general is material. So in fact, this convergence of Spinoza and Hegel is brought forth in many passages from Marx, because it is claimed that Marx is the first effort to combine these two. And when we were, by the way, at this very, very weird conference together in New York, I've heard quite a number of papers on this, on Spinozism of Marx. The point is that according to Ilyenkov, Marx exactly claims the allegation of the general and ideal in the matter as an inevitable part of the matter's dynamic existence and historical development. Thus, the general becomes not the category of logic and ethics, or rather, it becomes the category of logic and ethics rather than of metaphysics and of mathematics. I would give the example of generality, of how he explains the general, not via invariant, via combining certain attributes, similar attributes of and statistical attributes that in Aristotelian manner would coin things into some kind of universal or invariant objects. But claiming that the general is something that is biased by the lack. And I have already mentioned it in other papers. He is giving this example that generality connects to amplify one's lack in the other. For instance, the reader and the book are more general than the book and the book. Or the chair and the table is more general than the chair and the chair, as well, the objects that represent, for instance, furniture, etc. So the dimension of the generality is completely refurbished and reconsidered to organize it as some kind of generic machine that is biased by non-self. And again, this is a Hegelian reference to organize things Spinozistically. For example, any comment, Artem?
No. Discussing what you said.
Yeah. Again, this enables to see history and its formation as general, exactly biased by certain things aspiring to be non-self. So when you said that, for instance, this guy from Platonov tries to be Fyodor Dostoevsky and try to become subject, so try to become the self. I could give you another example from Moskva, Happy Moscow, or I don't remember whom, I think Sartorius. He buys another passport, so instead of upgrading into some kind of higher subjectivity, he's degrading into a lower, some kind of trans-subjectivity of the constantly other who will never be the self. So he's rather resigning the self and becoming the other self, but not in Lacanian not in Lacanian sense. When no matter how other you become, you are the I. Yeah. This is a complete split with the I. This is a complete split with the self, and I think that a new understanding of generality is crucial here to claim the common, the general, and the ideal as well. Another example that he gives is, so what is general and what is ideal? This is not something incorporeal, extracorporeal, not something abstract that is only imagined or desired or something flimsy, but it is something that is present and non-present, something that is and is not. And I will give example. This is not about specters. For example, he gives an example of a jar, an object that is made materially, and it has a nominal and objective body, but at the same time, whereas it is objectively a thing which is quite immanent and nominal, it incorporates lots of non-self being of this jar. And these non-self elements, when the jar is not quite the jar, so it is the jar at the same time not being the jar, are the labor of the potter that is inscribed, the labor of the previous potter from which this potter got the skills, the need, instigation, striving to make it, the project, when you don't yet have the pot or the jar, but you are still projecting to make the jar. So this is more what Hegel means by not ideal, but idéal. The projective striving and expediency. I wouldn't use the word teleology here, because teleology was definitely something that everyone, Laden and Slavoj, had dismissed when interpreting Hegel. But in Soviet Marxism, this issue of expediency as some kind of projective effectuation and formation is a very important phenomena, which would imply that things are on the one hand material, but by the token of implication of this non-selfness, diachronics, history makes them general and not identifiable with their material body. So this non-identifiability of each object in terms of its the object's capacity to be represented by other objects or by other beings, these non-self beings, are the claim and the dimension of the general to accomplish itself materially and ideally and generally.
So I'm sorry, but what would this be in Hegel, like the word general? Because what you described.
He uses allgemeine. He uses allgemeine. So this other determined non-self is something that is brought forth by historicity and history, and this is the reason why this concrete jar is both material and ideal, that is general, as long as it is biased by a non-self, its own non-self being as well as self-being. The same can be said about any other object. Thus, an ideal is nothing but the form of societal human activity biased by labor and hence, as we mentioned above, by need, instigation, and expediency. And labor here is understood not only economically or sociologically, but again historically and culturally. by this diachronic openness of awareness that any object that is surrounding us already inscribes many efforts of production. So not only product as product, but a labor effectuation which is never identified with an end product. So such activity can never be embodied in anything nominally fixed, and that's why labor is something that is material but at the same ideal. So it is labor that facilitates something to be material as well as ideal. And as Ilyenkov claims, this is Marx's invention, because the invention of Spinoza was that thought is already inscribed in matter, and nature needs thought, like substance needs thought as its attribute, and therefore it is nature that needs thought, and it is not that thought is imposed abstractly on matter and on nature. But what Ilyenkov claims was Marx's invention, that he insisted that nature is changeable and its change is irreversible. So, definitely, nature needs thought, but such nature that acquired the necessity of production, which is effectuated by human being. Such nature whose natural representation is already a laboring human being. And therefore, the answer is that labor is such natural force already, or the stage of nature that requires thought. And this is the minimal stage when thought can emerge and arise. But at the same time, the stage and the coinage of the materiality and generality. So the general ideal is exactly the realm that unravels the capacity of the world to exist in the regime of this other determined non-self, which we might define as the material ideal and which defines human condition. This means that the ideal is not something imposed or extrinsic to matter, but something quite materially revealing itself in human activity. And here's the quote. The ideal image of objective reality, therefore, also only exists as the form of living activity coordinated with the form of its object, but not as a thing, not as a materially fixed state or structure. And I already mentioned this minimal point of coinage of materiality and ideality, production, labor. But then the question, a very interesting paradoxical question in such case, is not this divergence between the one of the universality and the multiplicity of immanence and immanent thought. The self, the subject, or this extrinsic natural othernesses, which the post-philosophists so much refer to. But the point is about the paradoxical capacity to be the one and not the one at the same time. To be the self and not the self at the same time. To be the product and the product's potential genesis in the past and in the future at the same time. So to presuppose the diachronic context, but as well presuppose its own future development, but also expiry. And again, I mentioned that the subterfuge to natural history, which would generate thought as its necessity, is again complexity of human beings' labor. But then he has to justify Hegel and inscribe Hegel into this similar context of making him some sort of a realist. What is the problem is that the Spinozist stance doesn't allow to differentiate between a natural object and a produced object. And here is the moment when Marx comes au secours and just saves this whole situation. So a human being is then part of nature and deals with nature inasmuch as nature is molded into the process of labor, made the material for labor and human activity. And Ilyenkov quotes here Marx, which reads as follows: "It is precisely the alteration of nature by man, not solely nature as such, which is the most essential and immediate basis of human thought, and it is the measure that man has earned to change nature that his intelligence has increased. The subject of thought here already proved to be the individual in the nexus of social relations, the socially determined individual, all the forms of whose life activity were given not by nature, but by the process of the molding of human culture." So, and this is a paradox. So, well, let's be Spinozists and claim that we are just generated by nature, but at the same time claim that there is some kind of irreversibility. And this irreversibility starts with the moment of labor, but at the same time starts with the moment of thinking, but at the same time starts with the birth of society. So this is a very important moment when these things coin. Materiality, societal element, because when I said that one thing is identity, the self, and non-identity, this is precisely the societal nature of history. Because what are those others that contribute to making of everything? This is the labor that is societally conditioned, right? So labor, societal character, enables to claim things general and material at the same time. And how he justifies Hegel in terms of showing how Hegel is also helping Marx to develop this coinage of the materiality and ideality is that he claims that Hegel was one of those first efforts to prove that logic and abstract logic and thinking needs to think the world. So apart from thinking for itself and thinking for thinking, thinking needs to think the world. And actually we were all the time saying that this is non-conscious thing, like the world is non-conscious. And then we could claim this. We could claim that this dimension of the reality, where everything develops and is not yet achieving the individual consciousness to be reflected, is something non-conscious. But And the achievement of Hegel is that he coined these things, the abstract emptiness of the spirit and necessity to think the matter, necessity to think the real. But what is his extremely important point is that these non-conscious elements are exactly the societal strata which are consciousness. So, individual consciousness is not defining this reality, but reality becomes this very consciousness, and not Deleuzian unconscious, social unconscious, but this is consciousness that is not anymore a self-consciousness, not anymore an individual consciousness, but individual has any consciousness just by the token of consciousness being completely a societal dispersal. So this is what Ilyenkov wants to claim and how he wants to interpret Hegel and Marx, and by this way make this mutation from Hegel and Spinoza. So I would read this as follows because it's more understandable when it is written. It is a very peculiar condition when everything that evades logical thinking is not an unconscious realm of the subject, but is the materiality of the world, the generalness of world, produced by other subjects via labor, which is at the same time exceeding individual consciousness, but is simultaneously the true consciousness of the subject, has to become the true consciousness of the subject. And what is to be emphasized here is a special condition for non-conscious elements of real world, elements exceeding individual consciousness that would in psychoanalysis get into the unconscious or would form the socius machinic unconscious of schizoanalysis. Meanwhile, in the constellation that Ilyenkov reconstructs, these reality elements exceeding individual consciousness should define the generality of thinking and logic, because thinking, logic is biased societally, that is generally, and this is where general is. That is, being the non-conscious externalities, they construct the generality of logic and true general consciousness of any individual, since individual consciousness happens to be biased and has to be biased by objective reality. That's why this was first the Stalinist obsession, and then obsession with Lifshitz, and obsession with Ilyenkov, that objective reality is the true consciousness and the true general condition. Where we can coin the logical and the material. How long I'm speaking?
You have been speaking for 40 minutes, but how long do you have?
Like 5 minutes.
Okay.
So what Ilyenkov nevertheless disputes in Hegel is that for him activity of reality, activity of people is just prehistory for notion and for abstraction and for the spirit, whereas it should be completely other way around. It should be vice versa. Not that the sensuous concreteness should be manifestation of the general or the spirit, but vice versa. The general should be just the attribute of material concreteness. And here we come to Spinoza. The thought should be attribute of matter and nature. So what are these lexicons, crazy lexicons that he acquires? That labor is culture, labor is ideal, culture is material, but at the same time general. But also he has a very extreme interpretation of what thinking is and what thought is, and how thought is to be general, and how human being is a thinking intensity and thinking, not machine, but the only thinking presence in nature. He has phantasmagoria, which is called cosmology of spirit, which starts with eclipse not only of Earth but eclipse of solar system. And he says that let's imagine that not only human beings get extinct with their consciousness, culture, living, universality, materiality, whatever, but even solar system gets extinct. Does it mean that the human thought is also extinct and it existed in vain? And what is the human then if it is so easily extinct? And he claims that this extinction is not at all any problem, but he claims that this end of the world is on the contrary the creative possibility for the human thought to generate in other universal system. So the humans should be jubilating that their mind will get extinct, because this is creative. This is the creative end of substance, which enables in the other cosmic extension of cosmology to generate the mind, which will not be the mind of human creatures, but some other creatures. Maybe they will not be human, but this will be thought. And then the issue is: does it mean that the human existed in vain? And he says that no, because the human is the general. It doesn't matter. I mean, the Aristotelian interpretation of the human as the being that is inscribed in a certain way in the biology or in the natural context doesn't really matter, because nature cannot stand and cosmology cannot stand without thinking. It cannot stand without thought, so thought will ever remain, but it will ever remain as something that will acquire thinking as a societal capacity for the general, and general coming to communism. So if it happens in another system, it will be the same. Then the point is not whether we are calling it human or not. I end up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.